morning. This lecture video is going to go over the anatomy of the central nervous system. So we're going to look specifically at the brain and the spinal cord, and then there's a different video that will go over the anatomy involved in the peripheral nervous system, which will include the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. So there should be a packet. You can kind of follow along in color as we go through these different structures. We're going to start with looking at the general divisions of the brain, and we divide the brain into four major areas: the cerebrum, the diencephalon region, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So like if this is your brain here, you can kind of see here, this is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain. It is going to be made of folds and grooves, and you can kind of see that up close a little bit. The puffy parts are the folds, which are called the gyrus, or the gyri for plural. And then all of the little grooves in between the folds are going to be called the sulcus, or the sulci. And these kind of serve as landmarks that help divide the brain into functional and structural areas. The cerebrum is in charge of all of our higher order skills. So like this would include our learning, our judgment. It's going to control some of our voluntary motor activity. And then the next region is the diencephalon region. So if you kind of turn this around, and we're going to talk a lot more specifically about the cerebrum and diencephalon region in a second, but this is going to be this area up in here, and its job is going to control a lot of the autonomic nervous system, or our autonomic functions. The next two divisions then are going to be the brainstem and the cerebellum. So again, if you're looking at it from the outside, you can see the cerebellum is located right here. This is going to be in charge of coordinating all of our muscle activity. And then I'm going to flip it to the interior view here. This would include your brainstem, which is going to control all of our involuntary functions, and including our breathing, our heart rate, body temperature, our wake-sleep cycle. And it is going to eventually be connected out to your spinal cord. So those are the four major areas of the brain. Your brain is going to be surrounded by a layer of tissues, which are called the meninges. Their function is to protect the brain, and there are three tissues and then a space in between that's going to hold cerebrospinal fluid. So just to orientate yourself here in this particular diagram, this right here is the bone. So in this case, this would be the skull. Directly underneath that then is the first layer, or the outer layer, which is the dura mater. It's actually made up of two layers. It's a very tough layer. If you are in class and actually dissecting the brain, you can kind of cut through some of that dura mater and see how very tough that it is. Directly underneath that, attached to the dura mater, is the arachnoid mater. And then underneath the arachnoid mater is going to be a space, which is hard to see here on the coloring, but this space is called the subarachnoid space, and this is where cerebrospinal fluid is going to sit. Underneath that then is the pia mater, and this is going to be the tissue that directly attaches to either the brain or the spinal cord. So these three layers plus the subarachnoid space is going to make up your meningeal system. So if you've ever heard of meningitis, this would be when these tissue layers become inflamed, typically by a bacteria or a viral infection, and can have some very dire consequences if not fixed. So going back to the cerebrum. When we talk about the cerebrum, we are looking at, again, this main area here of the brain. So the cerebrum is going to be divided into lobes. So we have the frontal lobe, which sits right behind the frontal part of the skull. So it's going to be the front part of your brain. So if you're looking straight forward, this would be the front part. There is the parietal lobe, which is going to be up on top here. Then there's going to be the temporal lobe, which is in yellow. And then also the occipital lobe, which would be the lobe that's in the back, just superior to your cerebellum. The function of these different lobes is going to, each lobe is going to have a different function, a main job that it has to it. You can see here that there are a couple specialty gyrus that exist. So this is going to be the precentral gyrus, which would be in red here, and then the post-central gyrus, which would be in blue. So if we were actually flipping this around so it matched your diagram. Here's the frontal lobe, okay? Here's the precentral gyrus. Here's the postcentral gyrus. And then the groove that's going to divide those is going to be the central sulcus. There's also a lateral sulcus, which will divide the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes of the body. That would be located right about there. And then the longitudinal is going to divide the left and right halves of the brain. So looking at what these lobes actually do, there is the frontal lobe is in charge of personality, behavior, judgment, also learning. It contains a special area called Broca's area, which controls speech. Also controls the precentral gyrus, which includes motor control and will control muscle activity on the opposite side of the body. So remember that there's a switch that occurs in the middle of the brain where the signals get crossed, so the right side of the brain is going to control the left side of the body. The parietal lobe is going to interpret language and sensory information. It includes the postcentral gyrus, which is going to play a role in touch sensation. The temporal lobe, which is going to process auditory information and memory, and include the Wernicke's area, which is in charge of speech comprehension. And then the occipital lobe, which is going to be in charge of processing visual information. So if you look here, again, this kind of just shows you where these two specialty areas are, the Wernicke's area in the parietal lobe and the Broca's area in the frontal lobe. The corpus callosum then is this middle, very dense white structure, and it's going to be the communication structure between the left and right halves of the cerebrum. Moving down to the diencephalon region then, the diencephalon region is going to include the thalamus, which is going to be located right up in here, the hypothalamus, which is directly below that, and then the epithalamus, which includes the pineal gland right in the back. The thalamus's job is it's a relay station to and from the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus's job is it controls the autonomic nervous system, including hunger, thirst, and sleep, and your pituitary gland will sit just posterior to that, which controls all endocrine functions. The pineal gland is going to be your internal clock, or your circadian rhythm, so it's going to help control sleep-wake cycles. So when you're trying to sleep in on a Saturday morning and you get up at the normal time that your alarm would normally go off, you can blame your pineal gland for that. Your pineal gland releases a chemical called melatonin, something that you can get over the counter to help with sleep issues if you need it, but that is going to enhance the activity of the pineal gland. And then you have the brainstem here. So again, if I pull up the model of the brain, you've got your brain stem. This is going to be the medulla oblongata. This thicker part here would be the pons, and then the part that's way inside would be the midbrain. Midbrain is responsible for eye movement, auditory and visual signals. The pons is your main respiratory control center. Also, it plays a role in your rapid eye movement sleep. And then the medulla regulates cardiovascular and respiratory systems, swallowing, and blood pressure. Looking at your ventricles then. Your ventricles are going to be spaces located within the brain that are going to hold cerebrospinal fluid and help circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is made in the choroid plexus, which is located up here in the diencephalon part of the brain. Then you have a couple of ventricles, which is just a fancy word for chambers. So we have the third ventricle, the lateral ventricle, the fourth ventricle, which is going to sit right between the cerebellum and the brainstem, the spinal cord. These are going to be where the cerebrospinal kind of sits and circulates, and then the central canal is going to be where the cerebrospinal fluid will continue down through the spinal cord. So your spinal cord and your brain are surrounded by the cerebrospinal fluid, or contain it. The cerebral aqueduct is going to be this little tube or opening here, this canal, that's going to help circulate the blood within all of these different ventricles. Before we move on to the spinal cord, some commonly confused vocab that we should cover is the neuron is a nervous system cell. The nerve refers to the axon of a neuron in the central nervous system. Ganglia refers to a mass of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So nerve is always going to be central nervous system, brain, spinal cord. Ganglia is going to refer to the peripheral nervous system. And its job is to carry signals to and from the central nervous system. And then plexus is just going to be a big bundle of ganglia that are kind of going to intertwine from each other, branching off from the same point. Finally, looking at the structures of the spinal cord. Your spinal cord is divided into gray matter and white matter, just like your brain. So the gray matter is going to be unmyelinated neurons, and the white matter will be myelinated neurons. This is the front of the spinal cord. This is the back of the spinal cord. Typically, the posterior section of the spinal cord is going to be responsible for bringing in sensory information. The front, the anterior part of the spinal cord, is going to be responsible for sending and receiving motor signals to your muscles. So oftentimes information will come in through the back and it'll exit out the front. So if we start with the gray matter, we call the gray matter in the spinal cord horns. So there's a posterior horn, an anterior horn, and then the lateral horn here on the side. For the white matter, it's organized the same way. We call it columns though. So there's a posterior column, a lateral column, and then the anterior column. The central canal would be in the middle, and again, that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be falling. And then coming off the front is going to be a ventral root, which is going to carry motor information from the spinal cord to the body. And then coming off the back is the dorsal root. And the dorsal root is going to carry sensory information to the spinal cord. The dorsal root will eventually accumulate into a mass called the dorsal root ganglion, which is just a cluster of neurons in that dorsal root section. That is the anatomy involved in the spinal cord and the brain.